Most people think that the hard part of any kind of fat loss phase is the dieting itself. But in my experience, it's actually not the piece that most people find difficult. The hard part comes in when you want to stop dieting and you want to get yourself back to eating a decent level of calories, having a bit more flexibility in your life, but crucially without gaining body fat. Now, you might have seen the statistic that over 80% of diets fail, and that is actually true. But the findings come from how successfully someone is able to keep that weight off 12 months on. Because honestly, most people that come into coaching initially have successfully lost weight in the past through various different means, but essentially calorie restriction in some form, leading to fat loss. The problem is that they're never able to maintain that result, which tends to be what brings them to me in the first place. So today, I'm going to talk you through a real client example who has gone through a successful fat loss phase after spending a decent amount of time at maintenance, building muscle, getting metabolic health in a good place so that the body responds to fat loss, and then exiting back to maintenance without gaining back body fat. So this client finished dieting at the end of June, and we are now 6 weeks post-diet. In that period of time, we have added 400 calories to her overall intake, and body weight is now remaining stable. This is also a fairly early example, so we may be looking at extra bumps down the line. So what I wanted to show you here is how you can properly execute exiting a diet, how you can keep the results you worked so hard for, and how you can set yourself up for the next chapter. So let's dive in step by step. Now, you'll see all over social media before and after pictures, right? But it tends to be beginning of diet, end of diet. But nobody talks about the diet after the diet and whether this person who has achieved this amazing result has actually been able to maintain that in the long run. Now, the main reason why people will see often weight regain post a diet is because there is no plan for what they're going to do when that diet finishes. Or even worse, they don't really have a plan for when that diet will end. They just drive themselves into the ground until they literally can't do it anymore, and then it creates this big rebound effect. Now, after a dieting phase, you cannot and should not just throw all structure out of the window. There does need to be a pretty intentional approach to that if you're wanting to avoid body fat gain in the long run. I just don't see that there's enough conversation about maintenance being a skill in and of itself. Maintenance is part of the fat loss process. Without it, the results are always going to be temporary. And for this client, the top priority was seeing very, very little body fat gain in this process. So the way that we allow that to happen fundamentally is taking a phased and gradual approach to getting her back to that maintenance level. So when we think about the concepts of reverse dieting, the traditional sense of reverse dieting, taking small chunks of calories, increasing over a number of weeks versus just getting back to maintenance, both are equally as effective for minimizing body fat gain, okay? Because maintenance is maintenance. The only way that you can overshoot that is by overestimating where maintenance now is at the end of your dieting phase. Because during a diet, there will be a level of metabolic adaptation. And what that essentially means is over an extended period of time, if you are giving your body a certain amount of fuel that is eliciting a deficit, meaning it's not enough for your body to currently maintain where it is right now, there is an energy deficit. Over time, and this is not necessarily a bad or unhealthy thing, your body will start to adapt. Some of those kind of mechanisms that you may not even notice start to downregulate. So things like that non-exercise activity, right? So NEAT. And people tend to think about this as steps. And whilst steps, it's arguable whether it's part of NEAT or not, really it's less about intentional movement and more about spontaneous movement. So you might find that you just stop running around playing with your dog. You stop taking the stairs rather than the elevator, finding opportunities to sit down, less fidgeting. It's the things you have no control over that will start, whether you like it or not, to downregulate in a prolonged deficit. So your body is essentially really smart and it's getting more efficient. It's sensing that there is an energy deficit and therefore it needs to preserve some of those resources that it used to use pretty freely and openly. Now, as a result of that metabolic adaptation, we never know. There is no way of telling for sure exactly how much that has happened over the course of a diet. But we can assume that there has been an element of metabolic adaptation. And we can get some pretty good feedback here from things like scale weight trends. What will happen initially is body weight will start to drop pretty regularly, pretty consistently, in a meaningful way, whereas towards the end of a diet, that gets a little bit slower. That is essentially as a result of that metabolic adaptation. Your body isn't letting go of its fat stores quite so freely as it was at the start. Now pair that with the fact that, say you've lost 8-9 kilos, you are now in a fairly significantly smaller body than you were in the first place. So just baseline energy needs are also going to be different. A bigger human requires more energy than a smaller human. So we want to take both of those things into account when we're thinking about what your new maintenance really is. Now, when we think about after the diet, that increase in calories that I'm talking about, we will always see that the scale comes up a little bit on reintroducing a little more food. There are lots of reasons for that. So just having more food in your system overall, that is going to weigh something. There is more food in your digestive system than there was 2 weeks ago at any one time, okay? Because calories are now higher. There is going to be a small increase on the scale as a result of that. We're also going to see more glycogen and more water floating around your body from more food, okay? Usually more carbs as well tend to come in with an increase in calories, and every gram of carb brings 3 grams of water. So again, there's going to be an element of that. And the other aspect is that your training is likely going to increase in terms of intensity and output. So the actual aftermath, the impact of training hard, again brings with it lots of water, lots of glycogen in your muscle cells. So all of those things put together means there will always be a slight increase on the scale at this point, but it is just that. It's not body fat, it's water levels in the body predominantly, and it's not something to be too nervous about as long as you are monitoring those trends over time. That is probably the single most misunderstood thing about the entire process. People will add some more food, and even if this is objectively a sensible, appropriate level of increase, they will see the scale go up by 1 kilo, maybe even 2 kilos. They'll go, oh my God, this is not working. They'll panic and jump straight back into that cut, which is their safe space, because they know 2 weeks ago that scale was lower. And as you can probably see here from this real example, is that after diet, the scale predictably came up a little bit. And obviously we set expectations around that and we said, we know that is going to happen. The lowest point of a diet is not where you live. It is a temporary floor. What we're aiming for is a slight elevation from that and then some stability. So the step-by-step process for this client. Number 1, we decided ahead of time when her diet was coming to an end. Her diet had a start point and it also had an end point. And for this client, that was the end of June. This was very intentional. We had already pre-decided that was when we were getting out. It wasn't random. It wasn't get to a point where you're saying, I can't do this anymore and then we'll get out. It was intentional. And this is what sets you up beautifully for that exit to maintenance, having that intention from day one. We then added some calories gradually, but not all at once. Now, when it comes to my preferred approach to this, I will always take a pretty big jump initially. I prefer this rather than the traditional sense of reverse dieting, where you might add 50 to 100 calories every 1 to 2 weeks. The reason for that is psychological, but also physiological. So knowing if you're adding 50 calories every 2 weeks and you've got a 400 calorie deficit to make up, that is a long time where you are still eating less than you need. And it honestly requires a little too much, in my opinion, of that kind of mental vigilance once you've already spent a decent period of time, like restricting, honestly. That is what a diet is. So I don't love that for the psychological reasons, and also the physiological. Taking those tiny, tiny jumps, particularly in the early days, you are fundamentally still going to be in a deficit. So we don't really want you dieting any longer than you need to be. So with this client specifically, we added 300 calories overnight. Now, that exact number is definitely going to vary between every single person. It was clear to me that this client was perfectly capable of holding body weight stable with a 300 calorie increase. We know that from all of her biofeedback. We know that from dieting breaks that we had taken along the way during her deficit, that she is perfectly capable of handling that level of calories without body fat increasing drastically. Now, as those extra calories come in, you will find that your NEAT, that non-exercise activity, the unintentional spontaneous movement, that will naturally start to pick up. And she actually reported this from week 1 of feeling like, oh my God, I'm up and about again in a way that I was before. I didn't even realize that I'd stopped doing that, but I can definitely see I'm just more active at this point. That is the work of the extra calories. We then monitored that, looked at what was happening to the trend, could see that things were remaining stable. And she actually noticed after a couple of weeks of that big increase that hunger and appetite was really starting to ramp up a little bit. So initially, obviously she was feeling pretty hungry at the end of the deficit. We introduced that extra bit of food. She was feeling really lovely and satisfied. After a couple of weeks, we could see that all of those internal systems were starting to upregulate and match the current calorie intake. And hunger was starting to exceed that, which we expect, okay, because this still isn't her end point. So we then started to add little bumps at that point, a little more like the traditional concept of reverse dieting, where we thought about, okay, adding another 50 calories this week, adding another 100 calories this week, smaller chunks at that point to just respond to some of that extra hunger. And at this stage, we're getting closer to maintenance. So we are wanting to be a little bit more cautious around how big those jumps really are. So over the course of that 6 weeks post-diet, we added 400 calories to her current intake. And as I've mentioned, this is not the end point for her. We are only 6 weeks out, but we are out now at a level where we can confidently say we're eating more food, we're feeling well fueled. And crucially at this stage, particularly in the last couple of weeks, we've started to be able to introduce some more of that flexibility without having to have micromanaged control over every single thing that we're eating. So I like to think about adding calories back in after a diet like easing off the brakes in a car rather than taking your foot off the brake and slamming down the accelerator. Throughout this process, we absolutely made sure we were still doing things like prioritizing protein, around 2 grams per kilo of body weight for this client. And crucially, we really leaned into training hard. This is something you can really leverage when you're thinking about exiting a fat loss phase because you have more energy. You will notice the uptick in energy when you're actually eating closer to what you need rather than intentionally not enough. When it comes to tracking her progress along the way, we were looking at the trend and not the day-to-day. And this is something that is true for any part of any body composition journey because the scale will always be noisy. There will always be random highs, random lows. We're kind of looking at the average and what's happening week to week rather than day to day. A stable weight doesn't mean the same weight every single morning when you wake up, okay? It is always going to look different. Stable means fluctuating within a degree of normality. And for this client, that tends to be around 1.5 kilos. For some women, it's much higher than that. It totally depends on the person, but understanding what stable means for you is really important. So when we were looking at that progress week to week, each week we would ask ourselves, okay, are things remaining stable? If things are kind of fluctuating within the range we'd expect, great, then we can add a little bit more. If things were tracking up, then we would have said, okay, we hold here, we wait for another week, we assess where things are, and then make a decision as to whether anything needs to change at that point. We entered a 12-week cut, and as you can see from this beautiful example of fat loss, It is wiggly, it will always be wiggly, but it was trending down over the course of those 12 weeks. We hit that lowest point around the end of June, and then over the course of the last 6 weeks, we've increased food in a way that made sense for this client to protect the result that we've created. We saw that weight ticked up very slightly as expected, and then it remained stable. So now she's eating significantly more food. She's enjoying more freedom around food choices and exercise. She's holding her result. And crucially, the scale is a little up from where it was post-diet. That is not a failure. That is an expectation. It's a guaranteed inevitable. And her body composition is remaining the same. When we look at her progress photos, we can see that everything is remaining super, super stable. So the key takeaways for executing a diet and then exiting is firstly to have an end date. Okay, understand that the end of the diet is not the end of the process. You need an exit plan. Add those calories back slowly. Like I say, I prefer to add a pretty significant jump around expected maintenance, assess and add weekly or bi-weekly as needed. Expect the scale to rise a little bit. It's inevitable, but it doesn't mean you're going backwards. Keep protein high and really lean into your training intensity as soon as you're exiting that diet, and judge by that weekly trend, not the daily number. Stable and slightly elevated is what we're looking for, rather than maintaining the absolute lowest weight you've ever clocked in at. So if you've ever successfully lost weight, but then seen over the course of a couple of months that has all just come back on, it's because this is the part of the process that you have missed. Learning how to land the plane is just as important as the flight itself. And this is a huge part of what we focus on inside the Recomp Blueprint. Yes, getting an amazing result, but how do you maintain that in the long run? If you need some support, you can join the waitlist for coaching. I'm not opening the doors again until the end of September, but if you add your name to the list, I will reach out, get to know you, understand your goals a little bit more, and make sure it's the right fit for us both. As always, you can leave your questions in the comments, and I will see you next time. Love you. Bye.